Hey guys, today we're setting up completely dynamic sound along a river spline. Let's get to it. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're setting up realistic river sound along the entire length of a river spline. And by dynamic, what I mean is that the river sound is actually going to change based on the location of the player. So for example, if the player's on one side of the river, they should hear it on that one side. And not only that, I'm going to show you how you can change the volume and the pitch of the river sound based on how fast or how slow the water is moving at that location. And we're doing this by converting our water body river actor from 2 episodes ago into a blueprint, and that's going to allow us to make all sorts of modifications to it. So in this episode, we're going to focus on sound, but by having it as a blueprint, we can then replicate whatever we set up for a river in every single river or stream throughout our game. So for example, you could have things like fish in the river by putting it in the blueprint. And also in a couple of episodes, we're going to start setting up Niagara effects, and one of the first ones we're going to do is footsteps, including splash effects. So this is a pretty complicated blueprint that we're going to set up today. If you haven't previously worked with environmental sound, I strongly encourage you to check out the previous episode, episode 17, because that's going to give you all the baseline that you need for today's episode. And as always, the assets that I'm using today are completely free. They're available. If you go into the description below, there's a link to a spreadsheet, and you could just download them directly from Zapsplat in this case. So we have a couple concepts that we covered 2 episodes ago with Unreal Engine 5 Water, but a lot of new concepts today. So in this series, we have yet to cover vectors, and we're going to cover them today. We're going to use vectors constantly going forward. And also the concept of event tick is really important. And we got to use it this episode. Typically, I try to do everything I can to avoid it, but for this, we got to use it. So let's get to it. All right, welcome to today's episode, guys. And before we really get into it, I just want to go over what I built in preparation for this episode. It's all stuff that we covered how to do last episode, so feel free to check that out. So the first thing is we've got 2 different stream sounds. And then what I did is I created cues for each of them, and I tried to decide which I liked better, and I couldn't make up my mind, so I ended up creating this combined cue where basically we use a mixer node and I use both of the sounds together. And I just tested this out by hitting play cue. And what I ended up doing is adjusting the volume of these 2 slightly. So with the combined sound, they're a little bit louder. So I made the first one, which is kind of the deeper sound, a 0.6 volume, and the second one, which is kind of a lighter sound. So let me play that one. And this one. And so together they sound like... So together it just gave it a richer feel, and I couldn't make up my mind, so it was the perfect compromise. And the truth is, for sound in general, I find that I often get the best effect just by mixing and layering in multiple sounds, so feel free to try that out. And just remember, for each of these in the sound cue, set the individual wave to loop. The last thing I did is I created an additional attenuation file, and I did that by duplicating the one that we created last episode. And all I did was change up the inner radius and fall off distance a little bit. So the rivers are a little bit louder compared to regular environmental sound. So I increased the fall off distance to 2800, and the inner radius, I set this to 200 because this is going to be right in the middle of the stream, and that's where I want it to be the loudest. All right, now we're ready to create a blueprint for our rivers. And you heard me say last episode that basically anytime we have something dynamic, something that's going to change based on the experience of the player, it needs to be a blueprint. And that's exactly what we've got with these rivers now, because what I want is the sound to change depending on the location of the player relative to the river. I want the sound to actually sound like it's coming from the closest point of the river relative to the player. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to convert one of these rivers into a blueprint. And the way we do that is we select our asset in the world, and if you come up to the top right corner of the details panel, there's an option for converting this actor into a reusable blueprint class that can have script behavior. That's exactly what we're going to do. Now when you select that, you get this create blueprint from selection box. And typically what I do here is I just create a new subclass. And what that means is that the blueprint that we create, it's going to have all the properties of our river, because we don't want to get rid of any of the functionality that our river already has. For example, making it wider or narrower at a certain point, or changing the speed of the river, the velocity at a given point. And so by making it a subclass, we can add additional features without taking anything away from the parent class, which is the default actor in the world. And so its parent is going to be this water body river, and I'm just going to change mine to be water body river underscore BP, select. And now we've got our blueprint. So we have some initial preparation for this blueprint. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a new audio component. And this is what's going to actually play the sound along the river. And I'm going to call this river audio. And then, just like last episode, I want to set both the sound cue and the attenuation to be changeable when we actually place this blueprint into the world. And so the end result of that is I could use the same blueprint for multiple rivers. One could be pretty narrow and one could be pretty large, and I could have the sound be completely different for both. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to set two variables. So our first one, this is going to be called river sound cue. And this one, I'm just going to make a sound cue. And because this is going to be changeable when we place it into the world, I want it to be instanced, editable, and exposed on spawn. Compile, save, and I'm going to give this a default of the combined sound cue, which is this one here. And then we're going to do the same thing with attenuation. So I'll just come up again, new variable. This is going to be our river sound attenuation. In this one, I got to change the variable type to sound attenuation. If you just search for attenuation, you can find it right there, object reference. Same thing here, instanced, editable, exposed on spawn, and compile and save. And for this one, it's going to have the default of the 3000 that I showed you. So now we got to set up our river audio component, which is actually going to play the sound to use the sound cue from our variable and also use the attenuation from our variable. So to do that, we're going to go to the construction script and we'll drag in our river audio. And for this, we're going to set sound. And the sound is going to be our river sound cue, which I'll drag in, get, attach, connect this up. And we'll do the same exact thing for our attenuation. So river audio, and this is going to be attenuation settings. So set attenuation settings. And then we'll just bring in our river sound attenuation, get, connect. All right, so here's where this episode starts to get complicated. Like last episode, we need a mechanism by which when the player comes within a certain distance of the river, really whatever distance they're going to hear the river sound, then we need it to start playing its sound. And so just like last episode, we're going to use an overlap to make that happen. And so there's really two parts to this build. One is identifying when is the player close enough to the river for the sound to begin to play. And then the second part is adjusting the sound based on the location of the river relative to the player. So we're going to start with the first part and then we're going to go from there. And I just want to talk about the ways I was conceptualizing solving this problem before we really get into it. Because I was thinking about it as, could we just have a sphere collision and place that whatever point on the spline of the river is closest to the player. And then as the player runs, the sphere on the river kind of follows them to be the closest point relative to them. And I thought that was a really elegant solution because then we wouldn't need some crazy shape around the river to figure out when the player is going to overlap. And so I tried that, but the problem was the performance was terrible. Like my FPS at one point dropped to 12 because the system was having to calculate where the collision sphere was at any given point in time. And so ultimately I decided not to go with that approach, although it would be simpler in my estimation. So instead, we need a collision volume that's going to roughly span around the river's size and shape. And that's tricky because the river could be doing this. And really the best way of doing this would be to programmatically create some sort of spline collision where you have a different collision volume along the entire river. And I'm sure it's possible. In fact, I'm sure it's possible in blueprints, but it's just far more complicated than I'm willing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create one giant volume that encapsulates the entire river. And encapsulate is the key word there. We're going to use a capsule collision because instead of a sphere where the sound is specifically coming from one location, it's really coming from a long and thin location, which is the river. And I think that's better represented by a capsule collision. Now, of course, the capsule has its own issues because what happens if the river is short, but it's really wide because it's windy like that? I'll talk about how we can handle that. I don't have a great way of doing it, but if you come up with a better way and you want to post in the comments below, by all means, please do so. Regardless, I promise that this method will work and it's not going to be too performance intensive, even if you have multiple rivers in your scene like I do. So there are three parts to setting up this collision capsule that we're going to set up. So one is the capsule needs to be long enough to span the entire river. The second is it needs to be centered appropriately. And then the third is based on the windiness, based on the twistification, I don't know what to call that. Based on how meandering the river is, the capsule is going to need to be narrower or wider. So we're going to do the length of the capsule first, and then we'll go from there. And the length is going to be as the crow flies, so basically the straight line between the first spline point and the last spline point. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to get the location of each of these spline points and basically measure the distance. So if you navigate back to the construction script, and we're going to start on this right after our river sound attenuation here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the total number of splines of our river, because if this river expands and we add additional splines, we need to make sure that we get the last one. Now the first one is always going to be spline 0, so that's easy. But the last one is going to change depending on how many we have in the river. So the way we do that is I'm going to drag in my spline component. And luckily there's a function for splines that already exists. So we're going to get the number of spline points. And because the number of spline points always starts with an ID of 0, we need to subtract 1 from the last number. So I'm just going to do a minus sign, subtract, and we're going to subtract 1. So we need to get the location of this last spline. So I can drag this off and I could say get location at spline point. And you'll see by default, it connects this up to the point index. And so the point index is which point on that spline are we getting. And we need to do the same thing, but for the first spline. So I can just copy both of these, paste them below, and that's going to be point index 0. And you see these both return this yellow pin here called a vector. And basically, anytime you have a point in space, a location in Unreal Engine, that's typically represented by what's called a vector. So a vector is just 3 numbers, 3 floats. You've got your X, your Y, and your Z. And you can actually see this if you split the struct pin. If you right click and say split, you could see the X and the Y and the Z, and all 3 of those are floats. But I'm going to recombine. So now, how do we get the distance between these 2 points? Because that's going to be used to set the height of our capsule. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to drag off a pin, and I'm going to get distance vector, and we're just going to connect up our second one. And this is going to return a float, which is our actual distance. So now we got to set up our capsule because we still haven't done that. So I'm going to select our spline component here, and I'm going to add a capsule collision. And I'm just going to call this collision capsule. And if I go to our viewport, I can actually see that. Right now, it's absolutely tiny. See how small it is compared to our river? So that's the height we got to change. So back in our construction script, just going to drag that in to get a reference. And we're going to set the half height. So the half height is how tall it is, but it's actually half of how tall it is. So we got our overall distance of the river, and we need to divide that by 2 because it actually needs to reflect the half height. So I'll connect that up. So then we need to connect this node up, right? Because it's not connected over here. So I'm just going to drag a pin over. So now if I go to the viewport and I compile and save, so there's our capsule. So now our capsule is very tall and way too thin. But let's not worry about the width quite yet. Let's go back to the construction script. The truth is that it's actually going to be a little bit more complicated than this because we can't have the capsule just be the length of the river, right? The capsule has to be a little bit farther. It has to be however far the attenuation radius is, like whatever that fall off distance plus the inner radius is, because we want the player to be able to hear the sound even at the end of the river. They should be able to hear some of it. So basically, we need to add the attenuation distance onto this. And this attenuation distance might vary depending on the actor, right? So if I place a river in the world and it's giant, and I might want to use an attenuation distance of 5,000, which is like 50 meters away. And so because of that, we want to create it as a variable. So I'm just going to come up here, plus sign. This is going to be our attenuation distance. And this is going to be a float. And again, I want to make it instanced editable and exposed on spawn. And once you compile, then you could set a default value. I'm going to set this to be 3,000, and that's going to match the attenuation distance that's in our actual attenuation file here. But here's the thing. If the overlap, the capsule collision, is exactly the same distance as when the player starts to hear the sound, there might be some delay. There might be some problems if the player like runs into the space very quickly. And so I want that overlap to be a little bit further out, maybe like 500, like 5 meters, just so that it kicks in, the blueprint starts playing the sound, even though the attenuation isn't yet playing the sound in the headphones. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag off a pin here. We're going to add our attenuation distance because that's the 3,000. But then we're also going to add about 500. And so now I'll connect this up. And before I compile, let's go over to viewport. And this should be a lot longer now. Yep, there we go. All right, so now let's solve the problem with the orientation. So obviously we don't want this capsule collision to be straight up, right? We want it to be pointing in the general direction that the river is going. It's not going to be perfect because the river's curved, but at least we can point it in that general direction. And then we can make it a lot wider to reflect the overall river. So there's a neat trick where back in the construction script, based on these 2 points, we can find the look at rotation. So basically, what direction does the capsule need to be rotated at in order to look at the second point? So if I drag off a pin here and I say look at rotation, find look at rotation, and we connect up our second pin. And actually, I reverse this, right? Because it's going to start at point 0, and then the target is going to be our last point here. So the start is going to be there, and then we'll drag up this pin down here. And then if I come over to the right, I can just get our collision capsule again. And from that collision capsule, I'm going to set the relative rotation because we're setting the relative rotation of our collision capsule relative to the spline that's its parent component because we built it underneath. This is only going to work properly if it's built underneath, so make sure it's there. And I'll connect this up. Now I'm going to connect these two up, but this isn't going to work to start, and I'll explain why. So let me just connect them, come over to a viewport, compile, save. So nothing changed. So why is that? So by default, the collision capsule's forward direction is actually from the side of the capsule. So you could think of, for example, like the collision capsule of the player, where the player's standing up and they're looking straight ahead, and that's from the side of it. So we need to change the rotation of this 90 degrees so that it's actually facing in the right direction. So if I come back to the construction script, what we need to end up doing, and by the way, I just held down Alt and then left click to break the pin like we just did there. What we need to do is we need to split the struct pin for both of these, because that's the only way that we can add 90 degrees to our pitch here. So for the X and the Z, I'm just going to connect those up. But for our pitch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 90 degrees. Add 90. And just so that the spaghetti here isn't as bad, I'm going to double click, add a reroute. Same with the one above. So now let's go back to our viewport, compile, we'll see how this looks. So there we go. So we've got the right orientation, right? It's not centered properly, but we got the right orientation. So now we have to center the capsule relative to the 2 points. So how do we do that? So back in our construction script. So to get the center of these two spline points, these two vectors, basically we need to add them together and then divide by 2, and then add the first spline point to it, the initial 0. And so we got to do some basic vector math. And I'm far from a math expert, but I just looked this up and made sure I got it right. So I'm going to take our endpoint and then minus sign to subtract, and we're going to subtract from our second point here. And that's going to get the difference between the two, but then we need to cut that in half to get the midpoint. So we got to divide by 2. So slash to divide, and we're dividing all three values in the vector. So 2 by 2 by 2. But then we need to add this to our starting point. So we're going to get our starting point here, and then we need to add half of that difference to get the midpoint. And I'm going to set up some reroute nodes for all of these so I can drag them out, bring them closer to where we need them. And for the capsule, what we're doing is we're setting our relative location. So set relative location. And I'll connect that up. And our relative location is going to be right here. And again, I'm just going to go to the viewport, and what should happen is this should center itself kind of in between these 2 points. And it should also be long enough that it extends beyond the points. So compile. And there we go. So it's a little bit past here. It's a little bit past there. Perfect. The remaining problem, the last problem, is it's still way too narrow. And this problem is tricky, right? Because any way you slice it, this is going to be different depending on the river. Like this river right here, it's pretty straight, but others might be super windy all over the place. So we need a mechanism for adapting the capsule collision's width, what its radius should be. And because the rivers are going to be different depending on the situation, I think the best way of doing that is with a variable. And so I'm going to create a variable called river twistiness, river twistification, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be a float, and this is also going to be instance editable and exposed on spawn. And basically I want to set this so that if the river is almost perfectly straight, it's a 1, and then if the river is crazy windy, it's a 10. And so I'm just going to set a default value here to about 3, and I'll even put in a description in case I forget about this in the future. And so now, how do we set the radius of our capsule? So same thing as always, we drag in a reference, and we get radius, set capsule radius. And I'll connect this up, and right now it's 0, so this is where we got to build in our river twistiness variable. So again, we're going to get the length of our river from the first point to the last point of the spline. And from this length, I'm going to divide. So I'll drag it all the way out here, divide. One more reroute. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out another divisor here, and our top is going to be 5, and our bottom is going to be our river twistiness. And then we'll connect this up. So let me explain how this is working. So let's say the river twistiness is 5, like pretty twisty. So it's going to be 5 divided by 5, which is 1. And so it's going to be this value, which is the total length of the river, divided by 1. And that's going to be the radius of the river. So a pretty wide capsule. In general, this is not going to need to be that high. So 3, that's going to make the radius about half as wide. So if I come over to our viewport, let's see how this changes when I compile. Yeah, so that's a pretty large radius. And for this river, it probably doesn't even need to be that wide. But it's always better just to make the capsule extra wide just in case. And it's not too performance intensive to be overlapping multiple capsules like that. So we now have our capsule set up. I know that was a pain, but that was the biggest part of the build. So the next step, if we go over to our event graph, is we need the sound to begin playing when we overlap the capsule. So just like last episode, I'm going to go to collision capsule, scroll down on the right-hand side here, and get on component begin overlap. And we could delete out these except for event tick. We're actually going to need event tick. And we're making sure that the actor that overlaps is the third person character. So I'm going to cast to the third person character and just make sure that that cast succeeded before it begins playing the sound. So then we can drag in our river audio and we can simply say play and connect that up. And just so that it starts playing at a random location, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get our river sound cue. We're going to get the duration, and then we're going to set up a random range. So random float in range, and the duration is going to be the max. And this is going to be connected up here. And what that's going to do is it's going to ensure when the river audio begins to play, it could begin playing at any point in the audio file, since it's looping anyway. So now we can test this out. So compile, save, and we'll go into our game. So it's working, but it's only working at one point at the base of the river, at the spline point 0. Because we haven't yet changed for the sound to actually adjust based on the location of the player relative to the river. So if we navigate back into our water body river BP, and this is where we need event tick. Now, a quick thing about event tick. So in general, we do not want to use event tick. What that's doing is that every single frame of the game, whatever happens here with this execution pin, it's going to happen every single frame. And so that's really performance intensive. So for example, if you have a 60 FPS game, then every single frame, so 60 times a second, whatever you've got here, that's going to execute. And so having a lot of things running off of event tick, it's really not a good idea. It's going to bog down your performance. That being said, I want the sound to adjust in real time. I want the player to run along the river and feel like the sound is right with them relative to that river. And the best way of doing that is every single frame, so that it doesn't sound like the sound is jumping along the river. So the question is, per frame, how do we get where the sound should be relative to the player? And so for this, there's actually a really easy functionality in the spline where we can get the player's location at any given point in time, and then we can find the closest location on the spline relative to the player. So I'm just going to drag this up to start, and we're going to get player pawn. And then from the player pawn, we're going to get actor location. And so that's going to get where our player is at any given point in time. Now we need to get the closest location on the river to the player. So I'm going to drag in the spline component, and I'm going to find location closest to world location. And that world location is going to be the player's location. And I'll change this coordinate space to world. So what this is doing is this is returning the closest location on the spline to our player. And that's the location that we're going to set our river audio's location. So let's drag that in, and I'm going to say set world location. And we'll connect this up, teleport it to it, and that just means it moves instantly to that location. And then we'll connect up our event tick and compile and save. And now we're ready to try it out. All right, I hear my river, and I'm running along the river. And there we go. And it's getting louder when I'm in the interior. You know, the first time I did this, it was playing on this side instead of this side, and I had my headphones reversed. And you see now it's louder on the left side when I turn in that direction. So that's the basics of getting this set up, but there's a couple of things I want to do to make this even better. And then also at the end of the episode, I'll talk about a few ways in which this could be even more complicated depending on your situation and how to handle that. So the two improvements I want to make this episode, one is to improve performance and the other is to improve the quality, kind of the feel of the sound. So if we go back into the blueprint, for this event tick here, we really want to minimize when it's actually having to do something. So all of this stuff. So the way I thought of to minimize when it's actually executing this change in world location is we can set the event tick to not do anything unless a variable is true, and that variable could only be true on component begin overlap. And when the player ceases to overlap, then it turns off and this event tick just stops. So to do that, I'm going to create a new variable called allow tick actions, and I'll set this to be a Boolean, and this doesn't need to be exposed because we're just using it within the blueprint. And so this I'm going to drag in and say set. And so this is going to be set to true when it begins overlap, because that's when we want the event tick to actually happen. But then I'm going to go back to our collision capsule, and I'll say on component end overlap, so plus sign there. And we'll do the same kind of thing. I'll just copy these, paste them. And for this one, that's when I'm going to say don't allow tick actions, because we've ended the overlap. The player has run away from the river. And so now up here in event tick, very simple. Drag it in, get a reference. We do a branch. And if I should allow tick actions, then it's going to be true, do all this, and if false, does nothing. And the way we could test this out is we could just do a quick print string. So if I just do print string here, and I could say ticking away, and this one false, we're going to do another print string, and that's not going to be connected to anything. And I could say not taking any action. All right, let's test that out. So you see it printing there constantly on the left-hand side, ticking away, but now let me just run way across the map Get out of the range, not taking any action. Yep, perfect. And then if I get within range again, ticking away. Perfect. So now we know it's working. I can just delete these two out, connect up the true again. So the last thing we're going to do, this is purely aesthetic, but it's pretty cool. It's probably the coolest thing we've done in Blueprints yet. And that is, wouldn't it be cool if we could adjust the sound of the river based on whether it's coming from the upper part of the stream or downstream where the water's running a lot faster? Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to do this based on the water speed at spline points because I would do it that way if I could. But it doesn't look like the spline point water velocity is exposed to Blueprints. So I can't adjust that directly in Blueprints. You'd have to be a real programmer in order to do that. But what we could do is just make an assumption that upriver the water is not going to be as intense, not going to be flowing as fast, and then downriver the water could be flowing faster. And potentially we could create multiple copies of this blueprint where if there's a river where like in the middle there's some rapids and water's just going crazy, you could adjust that in the blueprint specifically for that river at that location for the sound to change in some regard. I think you'll have an idea of how to do that by the time we get done with this. So the first thing is we need a new variable because I want this to be a configurable option. If the river should sound exactly the same throughout the whole river, then this option should just be turned off. So let's create a switch. So I'm going to create a new variable, and this is also going to be a Boolean. I'm going to title this adjust sound upstream, question mark. So I'm just going to drag in our variable, connect it up to a branch, and we're not going to do anything in the blueprint past this point if this variable is set to no. But by default, let me go ahead and just set it to yes. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create some space here. Separate out these from this one, which is about to get complicated. So the way I'm doing this is I'm setting an anchor point. So basically the anchor point is where in the river do I want the sound to be completely normal, the bass sound. And that's going to be all the way at the end of the river. And as the player approaches the beginning of the river, that's where the sound's going to begin to change. And we're going to change it in two ways. We're going to decrease the volume substantially, but then we're also going to decrease the pitch just a little bit. And you'll see the effect that this has. So let's drag in a reference to our river audio. And from that, we're going to set our volume multiplier. And the multiplier is basically how much do we want to multiply the volume. If it's less than 1, it's going to make it quieter. If it's more than 1, it'll make the volume louder. And we're going to do the same thing for the pitch. So we'll get a reference and set pitch multiplier. And the reason we're also setting the pitch is not only does the water volume change as the speed of the water changes, but also how it sounds. But I want to alter that pitch much less than I alter the volume. So the volume is going to vary between about 5% all the way at the start of the river where it's barely flowing to full volume at the end of the river. But our pitch, it's only going to vary by about 20%. So I'm going to keep it in kind of the 80% to 100% range. So the lowest I want this pitch multiplier to go is about 0.8. And the reason for that is anytime I've taken a sound and altered the pitch more than 20%, almost always it sounds distorted. It doesn't sound anything like the original sound. So how do we determine what multiplier we're going to use for our volume and for our pitch at any given point on a river? So the first thing is we need to figure out where on a river our player is. So we have our player location here, but we got to figure out where that is relative to the start of our river and the end of the river. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to leverage what we already set up in the construction script. I'm just going to come down here and I'm going to copy both our end location and also our river start location. And once I copy those, I'm just going to come back into the event graph, paste those right underneath. And you'll notice under coordinate space, we're getting our player location in world space. Local space is where that thing is, like where the spline is relative to the main component, relative to where the actor is actually placed in the world. And we don't want to use local space in this case. We want to keep them all in world space so that we're using the same coordinate system for comparing them. So now the first thing is we got to figure out the distance between our character and the end of the river where the volume is the loudest. So the way I'm going to do that is I'll drag out a pin here and I'll get the distance and I'll connect up our last spline point here. Now this is the total distance, but we need to figure out what this distance is compared to the entire distance of the river, because that ratio, that's going to determine how much we shrink the volume. So we're also going to get the distance from the end of the river all the way to the beginning of the river, spline point 0 here. And so now we got to get the ratio of these. So we're going to divide one by the other. So let me give you an example of how this would work. So let's say our river is 1,000 units long, but our player is only 100 units away from the end of the river. So in that case, we want our volume pretty loud because the water is going to be running pretty fast at that point. So in that case, our distance here is going to be 100, but our total river distance is 1,000. Dividing these two, this is going to be 0.1. So we don't want our volume to be 0.1. We want our volume to be the full volume, which is 1, minus that 0.1. So we basically have to subtract this from 1. So I'll connect this up, and this is going to be 1. And I could just connect this up right here. But here's the thing. You heard me say I never want the volume to dip below 5%. So in order to ensure that that never happens, we're just going to do a clamp. Clamp the float. And the minimum is going to be 0.05, and that's going to be a 5% minimum. So now onto our pitch. And the pitch is going to work almost the same way, but the only difference is I want it to decrease at a much slower rate because the minimum, basically at the very front of the river, I want that to be 0.8 and then go up to 1.0. And so the way we're going to make that change at roughly 1/5 the pace of this change is I'm just going to divide this change by 5. And then we're going to do the same exact thing. So I'm just going to copy these two nodes, paste them over. And for this, what are we clamping the threshold at? It's going to be 0.8. And then I can connect it up. Let's compile and save, and now's the real test. So over here in our river, it's actually pretty quiet, right? It's not all that loud, and that's what you'd expect with the water not flowing all that fast. But as we get further downstream, a little bit louder and louder, and if I go on the other side of the bridge, it's going to be even louder still. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. So that just about wraps up this episode. But I actually want to throw a challenge out there for you to improve this sound further, because I'll probably end up doing this in a much later episode. But I think you got enough information here to do this yourself. And that is, I think the sound would sound even better if we get 2 points along our spline. So one that's like 500 units ahead of where we are on the river spline, and one that's 500 units behind. And then we play a reduced river sound there. Or maybe not even reduced because it's already attenuated, right? So I think it'll give it a more spatialized sound where you also hear the river in front of the player and behind the player, and it won't be kind of right then and there because the river is making that sound throughout. I think that'll also solve the problem where, let's say the river has a U shape and the player is kind of like right in the middle of that U. And so realistically in that case, you should be hearing the sound from 3 locations, right? This part of the U, that part of the U, and this part of the U. And as we have it currently, it's only going to play at whatever part of the U is closest to the player. And so I'll probably end up enhancing our river build in that regard. But I wanted to put that challenge out to you, because if you end up doing that and I test it out and it sounds great, I'll make the episode. I'll give you full credit. And then the last thing that inevitably we're going to have to figure out, but not at this present time, is what do we do when the player's head dips below the water? So in that case, we got to fundamentally transform the sound, right? And we'll cross that bridge in the due course of time, I'm sure, but not this episode. So the very last thing we always do with our build, anything worth collapsing into a function? Absolutely. Look at all this stuff. So I'm going to move out our branch here in our event tick, and we're going to select all of this. We'll right click on it, collapse to function. And let's just move everything into position a little bit closer to our onComponentBegin overlap. And for these, I don't think we need to collapse them to functions because it's really not that complicated what we're doing down here. But this function, I'm going to change the name. So I'll right click here. I'll call it update sound by location. And then if I navigate over to our construction script, yeah, this we also have a lot of spaghetti. So let's collapse that to a function. So select all this, right click, collapse to function, move it over. And this one I'm going to call set collision capsule. Whenever you create a function, I always notice that it does this, kind of dips right in the middle, so I just move these nodes out. So that concludes our episode for today. If you want to check out how we actually made these rivers with the new Unreal Engine 5 water system, that's episode 16, 2 episodes ago. And in our next episode, we're finally going to begin to work on player sounds. And we don't have any spells or attacks or anything on our character yet, but we do have running and walking. So we're going to start with footsteps. We're going to have different footstep sounds depending on whether he's stepping on wood, on our bridge, on stone, on the landscape, different landscape materials. So I hope to see you there.